The year is 1775. And across the Atlantic, King George III still believes he owns this land. But out here, in the muddy streets of Boston, something is about to crack. You can feel it in the air, the tension, the whispers, the cold stares between redcoats and colonists. For over a decade, every tax, every act, every ship unloading tea has been another nail in a coffin the crown refuses to see. This isn't a mob. This is a powder keg. And tonight, as lanterns flicker in the belfry of the Old North Church, one rider is about to mount his horse. He carries a warning that will ignite a continent. But here's the question that haunts every man and woman in the colonies: when you've been pushed to the edge, is it treason to fight back, or is it the only thing a free person can do? The British have been tightening the leash for a decade. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, each one a new rope wrapped around the necks of the colonists. But the people aren't just angry about money. It's deeper than that. It's about the principle that a man's home is his castle, and no king across the sea has the right to reach into his pocket without a voice. In towns like Lexington and Concord, the farmers are not just farmers. They are Minutemen, ready at a minute's notice. They've hidden their muskets, cast their own bullets, and trained on the village green after church. They speak of liberty in hushed tones, as if it's a forbidden love. And they know that the Redcoat Army, the most powerful in the world, is sleeping in their midst, waiting for the order to disarm them. The question isn't if they'll come for the weapons. The question is who will fire the first shot. On the night of April 18, 1775, the British regulars finally make their move. They leave Boston under the cover of darkness, marching toward Concord to seize the colonists' hidden arsenal. But the Patriots have eyes and ears everywhere. As the Redcoats row across the river, a signal flashes from the Old North Church, 2 lanterns, meaning the army is coming by sea. Paul Revere and William Dawes are already on the road, riding like the devil himself is at their heels. They gallop through sleepy villages, pounding on doors, shouting the news that will echo through history. The British are coming. Every farmhouse becomes a beacon. Every church bell becomes a call to arms. By the time the morning sun creeps over the horizon, the sleepy hamlet of Lexington Green is not asleep anymore. It is bristling with armed men, standing in the cold mist, facing down the most powerful army on earth. And no one wants to be the one to break the silence. The morning of April 19, Lexington Green. 77 Minutemen stand their ground against hundreds of British regulars. The tension is unbearable. Captain John Parker, a man with a rifle and a lifetime of conviction, looks at his men. They are vastly outnumbered, but they are not here because they want to fight. They're here to say, "This is our home. This is where we draw the line." Then, a single shot. No one knows who fired it. Was it a British officer shouting for the colonists to disperse? Was it a nervous colonist? It doesn't matter. The shot rings out, and hell breaks loose. The Redcoats fire a volley, then charge with bayonets. 8 colonists fall dead on the green. The American Revolution has begun, not with a grand declaration, but with a bloody skirmish on a small town common. The British march on to Concord, but they've awakened something they cannot control. The countryside is rising. And every farmer, every blacksmith, every boy old enough to hold a gun is now an enemy of the crown. But the day is far from over. After the massacre at Lexington, the British push on to Concord, thinking they've cowed the rebellion. They're gravely mistaken. At the North Bridge in Concord, a force of Minutemen, now swelled by hundreds of angry farmers, confronts the Redcoats again. This time, they're not just standing their ground. They're advancing. For the first time in history, colonial militia men face the British army in an open field and give the order to fire. The British line breaks. They've never seen this kind of resolve. The redcoats begin their long, bloody retreat back to Boston. And that's when the true horror of this new war reveals itself. Every tree, every stone wall, every barn becomes a firing position. Men shoot from behind fences, from upstairs windows, from the cover of the wood line. It's not a battle, it's a gauntlet. The British are not marching, they're running for their lives. By the time they stagger back to Boston, nearly 300 of their own are dead or wounded. The myth of British invincibility has been shattered on the road from Concord. The British are now trapped in Boston, surrounded by a ring of armed citizens who have tasted blood and smelled victory. The colonial militia, the seeds of a continental army, is digging in. They have no uniforms, no standard weapons, no formal training. But they have something the British never expected, a cause they'll die for. The siege of Boston has begun. And from this moment, there is no turning back. The leaders of the rebellion, men like John Hancock and Samuel Adams, are now fugitives with a price on their heads. The political battle is over, the war has begun. But the question that will define the next 8 years is not about guns or territory. It's about whether a ragtag group of farmers can stand against the greatest empire of the age. As the smoke clears over the Massachusetts countryside, a young plantation owner from Virginia is already sharpening his sword. He is about to be called to lead. But who is this man? And what makes him believe he can defy a king? That's the story we'll tell next time. If you want to see how a rebel becomes a general, and how a losing cause becomes a nation, make sure you're subscribed and have the bell on. Because history is about to get a whole lot more dangerous. The British are bleeding in Boston, but their king is not backing down. King George III declares the colonies are in open rebellion, and Parliament votes to send 20,000 more troops across the Atlantic. But here's the thing they don't understand, every ship that arrives with soldiers also arrives with news of British aggression. And that news is spreading like wildfire. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress is torn. Some delegates still want to patch things up with the Crown. But men like John Adams are arguing something radical, that the colonies need to govern themselves. The moderates call him reckless. The loyalists call him a traitor. But Adams looks at the burning towns and the blood-soaked roads of Massachusetts, and he knows that compromise is already a corpse. While politicians argue, the army outside Boston is growing into something more dangerous. The militias from all over New England are pouring in, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. They're not just farmers anymore, they're an army of occupation, and they've got the city in a stranglehold. But they have a problem, no gunpowder. Historians will tell you the Continental Army had shortages, but in the summer of 1775, it was almost catastrophic. Some soldiers have just a few rounds each. If the British knew how low their supplies were, they could have broken out at any moment. So the Americans do what they've always done in a crisis, they improvise. They send expeditions to raid British forts in the north for cannons and powder. The most audacious plan comes from a man named Benedict Arnold, a name that will become either a legend or a curse, depending on who you ask. But before that audacious plan can unfold, a new leader must step forward. The Continental Congress knows this militia needs a commander-in-chief, someone who can unite the colonies behind one army. The choice is obvious to some, terrifying to others. George Washington walks into the Second Continental Congress in his old Virginia militia uniform, the only man in the room wearing military dress. He doesn't campaign for the job. He doesn't ask for it. He simply shows up, ready to serve, and that silent gesture speaks volumes. On June 15, 1775, Congress unanimously elects him to lead the Continental Army. Washington accepts with a heavy heart, telling them he's not sure he's up to the task. But privately, he's already planning. He knows that this isn't just about Boston anymore. It's about proving to the world that a free people can govern themselves. And he's about to ride north to take command of a siege that will test his soul. But Washington isn't the only one moving. As he travels north, the British in Boston are getting desperate. They're running out of food, and their commander, General Gage, is a man on the edge. He knows he's sitting on a powder keg. On June 17, the Americans make a move that shocks everyone. They sneak onto Breed's Hill, a small elevation right under the British noses, and build a fort in one night. When the British wake up, they see a fortress staring down at them. Gage's officers tell him to land troops behind the hill and cut the Americans off. But Gage is arrogant. He orders a frontal assault. The red-coated soldiers march up the hill in perfect formation, weighed down by their heavy packs. The Americans hold their fire until they can see the whites of their eyes. Then they unleash a volley that decimates the front line. The British fall back, reform, and charge again. They are met with the same deadly fire. It's not a battle, it's a slaughter. This is Bunker Hill, and it will become the bloodiest lesson of the war. The British take the hill, but at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 of their men are dead or wounded, including a shocking number of officers. The Americans, low on ammunition, are forced to retreat, but they've proven something immortal. They can stand toe-to-toe with the best army in the world and make it pay in blood. Word of the battle reaches London, and the king's confidence turns to rage. He dismisses Gage and brings in a new commander, a man named William Howe. But Howe, despite his victory, is haunted by the carnage. He will never again order a frontal assault on entrenched Americans, a fear that will paralyze him later in the war. Meanwhile, Washington arrives in Cambridge to take command of the army. He sees his men, ragged, half-armed, and camped in filth. He looks at the British lines across the river, and he knows the real war has just begun. This isn't a rebellion anymore. It's a revolution, and it will demand everything they have. So here's the picture: Washington has an army, but it's melting away. Enlistments are ending, men are going home, and he can barely keep 1,000 soldiers from deserting. He writes to Congress, begging for supplies, for gunpowder, for anything. But the true crisis is even deeper. He's facing a city that's heavily fortified by the British Navy, and he has no cannons to break the siege. The stalemate could last forever. But Washington is a man of action, not patience. He devises a plan so bold, so desperate, that it could end the war in one stroke, or lose it. He's got his eyes on a frozen fortress in the north, a place called Ticonderoga, where there are cannons just sitting there for the taking. It's a 150-mile trek through snow and wilderness. But if he can get those guns, he can change the game. He sends his most trusted officer, Henry Knox, on a mission that seems impossible. And what happens next will decide the fate of the American Revolution. What happens next is the story of the guns of Ticonderoga, and it's coming up in our next chapter. But before Henry Knox can even dream of moving those cannons, he has to survive the journey just to reach them. Think about that. A 25-year-old bookseller from Boston, a man who's never commanded more than a handful of men, is now being handed the fate of the revolution. He rides north through the dead of winter, the snow already piling up around him. The roads are barely passable, the cold is biting through his coat, and every mile takes him further from safety and deeper into the wilderness. He knows the guns are there, sitting in a dilapidated fort, but between him and those guns lies 150 miles of frozen rivers, jagged mountains, and howling winds. There's no map, no supply line, no backup. Just a young man and a promise he made to George Washington. And if he fails, the siege of Boston falls apart. The revolution might just die right there in the snow. Meanwhile, back in Cambridge, Washington is dealing with a crisis of his own. His army is not just melting away, it's rotting. Smallpox is sweeping through the camps, and every day more men are too sick to stand, let alone fight. The soldiers are starving, their uniforms are rags, and the ones who can walk are talking about going home. Their enlistments are up in a matter of weeks, and no amount of patriotic speeches can fill their empty stomachs. Washington knows he's sitting on a powder keg. If the British across the river sense even a hint of weakness, they'll strike, and his ragtag army will be annihilated. He writes letter after letter to Congress, begging for men, for money, for anything. But Congress is slow, distant, and paralyzed by its own debates. So Washington does the only thing he can do. He waits. He watches. And he prays that a young bookseller named Henry Knox can pull off the impossible. And what of the British? They're not idle. General William Howe, the man who won Breed's Hill but lost his soul there, is now in command. He has the greatest navy in the world at his back and a well-supplied army in front of him. But he's haunted. The memory of that slaughter on the hill, the piles of his own dead, it's frozen something inside him. He could attack Washington's weakened forces right now and likely crush the rebellion in a single blow. His officers are begging him to do it. But Howe hesitates. He's seen what happens when you charge into American lines, and the image of those muskets flashing from behind stone walls is seared into his mind. So he waits, and he fortifies, and he lets the winter drag on. It's a fatal indecision. While he hesitates, the rebellion gets stronger. While he hesitates, Henry Knox is struggling through the snow, dragging the very tools of his own future defeat. Back on the frozen trail, Henry Knox is learning what desperation really means. The cannons are heavier than he imagined, some weighing over a ton. He's got to build giant sleds to carry them, and he needs oxen to pull those sleds. He's buying up every ox he can find, paying farmers with promises and paper money that might be worthless tomorrow. The weather is a constant enemy. Snowstorms hit without warning, and the men have to dig the guns out of drifts that are taller than a man. The Hudson River is a particular nightmare. The ice is treacherous, and at any moment a cannon could break through and sink to the bottom. Knox writes to Washington, and his letters are a mix of confidence and sheer terror. He knows he's in over his head, but he also knows there's no turning back. Every mile he covers brings the Continental Army closer to victory, or at least, a fighting chance. There's a moment, deep in the Berkshire Mountains, when the entire mission almost comes to an end. A sudden thaw turns the trail into a river of mud, and the heavy cannons sink up to their axles in the muck. Men and oxen alike are exhausted, and the drivers are on the verge of mutiny. They're not soldiers, just hired hands and local farmers who want to go home to their families. Knox is faced with a choice. He can push on and risk losing everything, or he can turn back and admit defeat. But he's not the kind of man who accepts defeat. He gets off his horse, grabs a rope, and starts pulling alongside the men. He curses, he encourages, he pleads. And slowly, inch by inch, they get the cannons moving again. It's not a glorious moment of triumph. It's a gritty, muddy, exhausting effort of pure will. But it's in that moment, that the revolution is truly born. Finally, after weeks of hell, Knox and his men dragged the last cannon into the outskirts of Cambridge. The army that was on the verge of collapse now has 59 pieces of artillery. Washington can hardly believe his eyes. But there's no time to celebrate. He knows the guns need to be placed, and he knows exactly where. There's a hill called Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston and the British fleet in the harbor. If he can get the cannons up there in one night, he can command the entire city. It's a risky, audacious move. But Washington has learned from Howe's mistake. He won't attack head-on. He'll use the fear of cannons, not the bayonet. He and his officers planned the operation in secret, and on the night of March 4th, they set their plan in motion. The entire army moves in silence, hauling the heavy guns up the frozen hill. It's a race against dawn. The fate of the siege, the fate of the rebellion, comes down to this single, quiet night. And what happens when the sun rises over Boston, will change the world forever. The night is bone cold, but the men are sweating. They work in complete silence, muffling the wagon wheels with rags, wrapping the chains so they don't clink. Washington's plan is sheer madness. Move 59 cannons up a 200-foot hill, right under the noses of the British fleet, all in one night. If a single man coughs too loud, if a single horse stumbles, the whole garrison opens fire. But they don't stop. They haul, they push, they drag. Hay bales are stacked as a barrier to muffle the sound. By midnight, the first cannons are in place. The men work through the freezing hours, their breath visible in the moonlight, their hands bleeding on the ropes. And as the first gray light of dawn creeps over the harbor, the British look up, and see a fortress where there was only empty grass. It's a miracle. It's a ghost story. And it's only the beginning. When General William Howe looks through his spyglass that morning, he doesn't see a hill. He sees his own death warrant. The cannons are pointed directly at his ships in the harbor. His army is trapped in Boston like rats in a cage. He has two choices. He can stay and watch his fleet get blown to pieces, or he can launch a frontal assault on the hill. He's a brave man, but he's not a fool. He knows that a direct attack will be a slaughter. So he orders his troops to prepare for an amphibious landing. Thousands of redcoats pile into boats, ready to storm the heights. But as they approach, the weather turns violent. A sudden nor'easter, a brutal mix of wind and snow, slams into the harbor. The waves become too rough for the boats to land. The attack is called off. It's a moment of pure divine intervention. Washington watches from the hill as the storm scatters the British fleet. He doesn't fire a single shot. He doesn't need to. The weather has done his work for him. And now, the siege is effectively over. Howe is not a coward. He's a professional soldier, and he knows when a battle is lost. He calls his officers together and gives the order that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Evacuate Boston. The British have occupied this city for 8 years. It's been the center of their power in the colonies. And now, they're going to leave it without a fight. As the news spreads, loyalists in the city are terrified. They know what happens when the rebels take control. They know what they've done to their neighbors, the insults they've hurled, the names they've called. They know there will be a reckoning. Thousands of them gather their belongings and beg to be taken aboard the British ships. It's a chaotic, desperate scene. The harbor is filled with boats overloaded with families, furniture, and fear. And as the last ships sail out of the harbor, you can almost hear the city breathe a sigh of relief. But for Washington, it's not a victory. It's an opening move. On March 17, 1776, the last British ship disappears over the horizon. The city is free. Washington rides into Boston at the head of his army, and the streets are lined with people who can't believe their eyes. They're crying, they're cheering, they're throwing flowers. They've been under military occupation for 8 long years. And now, they're free. But Washington doesn't smile. He looks at the damage, the empty houses, the scarred hills. He knows this is just the beginning. The British army is still intact. They've just lost a city, not a war. He writes a letter to Congress, warning them that the next target will be New York. It's the largest, richest port in the colonies. And he knows that the British will come back with everything they have. He doesn't wait for orders. He marches his army south, leaving Boston to celebrate its liberation. He knows that the real fight, the one that will decide the fate of this nation, is only just beginning. But there's a shadow hanging over this victory. In the harbor, a single British ship remains. It's not a warship. It's a sloop, sitting low in the water, waiting. As the last of the fleet disappears, it takes off its disguise. It was never going to leave. It was a trap. The ship is loaded with gunpowder, rigged to explode. The British aim it at the docks, hoping to destroy the city in one final act of spite. The fuse is lit. The ship begins to drift towards the wharf. The people on shore, still celebrating, don't notice the danger. They don't see the smoke curling from the deck. They don't hear the hiss of the fuse. It's a moment of pure terror, a secret that could have erased the joy of the entire day. But as the ship gets closer, a young sailor on watch finally sees it. He screams a warning. And a handful of men, brave men, race towards the burning ship, ready to die to save their city. They dive into the icy water, swim to the ship, and cut the anchor line. The tide pulls it away from the docks just as the flames reach the powder magazine. The explosion is deafening. A column of fire and smoke rises into the sky, shaking the windows of the city. But the docks are saved. Boston is saved. Washington watches the explosion from a distance and feels a chill run down his spine. He knows now, more than ever, that this war will not be fought with honor or mercy. It's a war of survival. He looks east, towards the Atlantic, where he knows the British are regrouping. He knows that the next battle, the one that will decide the fate of this fragile nation, will be fought in New York. And he knows that he will be outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. The victory at Boston is already a memory. The fight for America is just beginning. So, who is the British commander waiting for him in New York? And why is he so confident he will crush Washington's army? The answer will shock you. Subscribe and join us for the next chapter, where the rebellion faces its darkest hour. The smoke from the explosion is still curling into the sky, but the city is safe. The celebration, though, is tinged with a new fear. Washington walks the empty streets of Boston, his boots echoing on the cobblestones. He sees the damage the British left behind, the abandoned homes, the scars of a long occupation. He knows this is just a taste of what's to come. He stops at the harbor's edge, staring at the water, his mind already racing ahead. This victory, as sweet as it is, feels fragile. He's not a politician, he's a farmer turned soldier. And he knows that the real test of this rebellion won't be a siege, but a full-scale war against the most powerful army on earth. He turns to his officers, his voice low and firm. We have won a battle, not the war. They will come back. And we must be ready. The question hangs in the air, unspoken, are they truly ready for what's coming? But Washington doesn't have time to dwell on the past. Intelligence reports are already piling up on his makeshift desk. New York. That's where the British are heading. It's a strategic nightmare, a city of islands and rivers, perfect for the British Navy to dominate. Washington knows that defending it will be like trying to hold water in a sieve. He spreads his maps across the table, his finger tracing the coastline, the Hudson River, the East River. He knows he's walking into a trap, but he has no choice. If he abandons New York, the rebellion loses its credibility. If he stays, he risks losing his entire army. He looks up at his aides, his face etched with worry. They're sending their best, he mutters. The Howe brothers. One commands the army, the other the navy. They've fought in Europe. They've never lost. The room falls silent. The weight of the challenge is crushing. This is no longer a colonial squabble, it's a chess match with the fate of a nation at stake. And then there's the other threat, the one that's harder to fight than any army. Disease. Smallpox is already sweeping through the ranks. Soldiers are dying in their tents, not from British bullets, but from a sickness that spreads like wildfire. Washington remembers his own bout with the disease years ago, the fever, the pain, the scars. He makes a controversial decision. He orders that every soldier be inoculated, a risky procedure that could kill them but might also save them. It's a gamble. Some of his officers protest, saying it will weaken the army. But Washington is firm. Better to lose a few to the needle than to lose the entire army to the plague, he says. He walks through the camp, watching as the soldiers are treated, their faces pale with fear. He knows he's asking them to trust him with their lives. And he knows that this war will be won not just with muskets and cannons, but with science and sheer will. The rebellion is not just a battle for territory, it's a battle for survival against an invisible enemy. While Washington prepares his army for the march south, a different kind of battle is being fought in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress is in a heated debate. The idea of independence, once whispered in secret, is now being shouted from the floor. Men like John Adams are pushing for a complete break from the crown. But others are hesitant, afraid of the consequences. They read letters from London, hoping for a reconciliation that will never come. But the events of the past year, the blood shed at Lexington, the burning of Falmouth, the siege of Boston, have changed everything. Adams rises to his feet, his voice shaking with passion. The question is not whether we should be independent, but whether we are brave enough to declare it. He argues that every day they delay, the harder it will be to win. He knows that the world is watching. He knows that they need a document, a statement so powerful that it will rally the people and convince foreign powers to support their cause. He sets the stage for a declaration that will echo through the ages. But the fate of the nation doesn't rest solely on the words of politicians. It rests on the backs of ordinary men, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers who have traded their plows for muskets. These are the men marching with Washington, their shoes worn thin, their uniforms patched and faded. They are heading south to New York, a city they know will be a bloodbath. There's no grand speech, no waving flags as they leave Boston. Just a quiet, grim determination. A young soldier from Massachusetts, barely out of his teens, walks beside his father. "Will we win, Pa?" he asks. The father looks at his son, his eyes tired but resolute. "We have to, son. There's no going back now." They march on, their footsteps a drumbeat of defiance. They are not fighting for glory or for land. They are fighting for an idea, a radical notion that a man has the right to govern himself. And that idea, once planted, is impossible to uproot. The British may have the best army and navy in the world, but they do not have what these men have, a cause worth dying for. Across the Atlantic, a new commander is preparing for his destiny. Admiral Richard Howe, known as Black Dick for his dark complexion, is a man of immense experience and cunning. He's sailing to America with the largest expeditionary force Britain has ever assembled. Over 400 ships, carrying 30,000 soldiers, including Hessian mercenaries, the most feared fighting men in Europe. He's confident. He's not just going to crush a rebellion, he's going to end it. He stands on the deck of his flagship, the HMS Eagle, looking at the vast armada around him. He believes that one overwhelming show of force will make the colonists see reason. He believes that Washington's ragtag army will scatter at the first sight of a professional British line. He doesn't understand that he's not fighting an army, he's fighting a people. He's not fighting for land, he's fighting a ghost. And in this war, the ghost might just win. So, what happens when the greatest navy in the world meets a determined ragtag army on the shores of New York? Subscribe and find out, as the rebellion faces its greatest test in the next chapter. But even as Washington's army marches south, a storm is brewing in Philadelphia. A man named Thomas Jefferson, a quiet, scholarly Virginian, is locked in a room, his quill scratching against parchment. He's not writing about battles or strategy. He's writing about the very soul of a nation, about unalienable rights, about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are not just words on a page, they are a declaration of war against an empire. And when they are signed, there is no turning back. But how does a declaration of a few thousand words change the reality of a war? How does it embolden a starving, tired army? The answer is simple: it gives them something bigger than themselves to fight for. It transforms a rebellion into a revolution. Meanwhile, in New York, the British are not idle. General William Howe, the man who let Washington escape from Boston, is now determined to make a different kind of statement. He's not just a soldier, he's a politician in uniform. He believes in a strategy of conciliation, of winning hearts and minds with offers of pardon. But his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, sees things differently. They need to be crushed, not coddled, he argues. This family disagreement is a dangerous fault line at the heart of the British command. While they debate, their army swells with new recruits, including thousands of Hessian mercenaries, professional soldiers who fight for money, not for a cause. They are the most feared fighting force in Europe, and they are about to land on American soil. Washington sees the storm gathering and knows he's outnumbered. He has about 19,000 men, but many are sick, untrained, and barely equipped. The British have over 30,000 professional soldiers, backed by the most powerful navy on earth. How do you win against such odds? Washington's answer is not strength, but deception. He orders his men to fortify Brooklyn Heights, a strategic position overlooking the harbor. But he also knows that if the British attack in full force, his army will be annihilated. He's playing a dangerous game of chess, and one wrong move could end the revolution. He looks across the water at the British fleet, a forest of masts and sails, and feels the weight of a nation on his shoulders. Every decision is a gamble, and the stakes are the future of America. But the greatest threat to the American army isn't just the British, it's time. The enlistments of many soldiers are about to expire. They signed up for 1 year of service, and that year is almost up. These men are tired, hungry, and homesick. They fought in Boston, they marched to New York, and now they're being asked to face the most powerful army in the world. Why would they stay? Washington walks among them, a tall, imposing figure, and speaks to them not as a general, but as a fellow citizen. If you leave now, he says, you will leave your homes, your families, and your liberty to the mercy of a tyrant. If you stay, you have a chance to build a new world. His words are powerful, but they are also a plea. He needs a miracle, and he knows it. And then, on July 2, 1776, the Continental Congress votes for independence. 2 days later, the Declaration is adopted. When Washington reads it to his men in New York, it's not just a formality. It's a transformation. The army erupts in cheers. They tear down the royal coat of arms from the tavern where they're quartered. They are no longer fighting for a redress of grievances, they are fighting for a new nation. But the celebration is short-lived. A few days later, on July 12, Admiral Howe's fleet arrives in New York Harbor. The harbor is so full of British ships that, as one observer notes, the forest of masts was so thick that the water was barely visible. It is a terrifying sight, a floating city of war, and it's all aimed at them. The moment of decision has come. The British don't attack immediately. They wait, probing the American defenses. Then, in late August, they strike. A massive force lands on Long Island, and the Battle of Brooklyn begins. It's a brutal, chaotic fight. The Americans are outflanked, outmaneuvered, and outfought. Washington watches from a hill as his beloved army is routed. He's seen combat before, but nothing like this. It's a massacre. Thousands of his men are killed or captured. The revolution, it seems, is over. But as darkness falls, Washington makes a desperate decision. He will evacuate his remaining troops across the East River under the cover of night. It's a risky, almost impossible maneuver. British troops are on three sides, and the river is patrolled by British warships. One wrong move, one sound, one light, and they will all be captured or killed. As the boats silently cross the dark water, you can't help but wonder, is this the end of the American dream? And who will be left to tell the story? To find out what happens next, and how Washington pulls off one of the greatest escapes in military history, you have to follow this channel. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next chapter of this incredible story. The night is a gambler's bet. Washington has one chance, and it's a long shot. The plan is simple, but the execution is a nightmare. 900 men, under General Mifflin, are ordered to hold the line against the entire British army, to buy time for the rest to slip away. They are a rear guard, a sacrifice. On the Brooklyn shore, soldiers load onto a motley collection of boats, ferryboats, rowboats, anything that floats. The oars are muffled with rags. Orders are whispered, not spoken. The crossing begins at 9 p.m., a slow, agonizing crawl across the black water. A single British patrol boat could end everything. The men are tense, their muskets primed, their eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the city they're leaving behind. They're not just retreating from a battle, they're retreating from a dream that has soured into a nightmare. Dawn approaches, and half of the army is still on the Brooklyn side. Panic starts to set in. If the British discover the escape, the boats will be sitting ducks. Just as the first rays of light begin to paint the sky, a miracle occurs. A thick, dense fog rolls in off the harbor, so heavy you can barely see your hand in front of your face. It's a godsend. The British, on the other side of the lines, can't see a thing. The evacuation continues, now even faster, using the fog as their shield. General Mifflin's rear guard, the last 900 men, finally receive the order to fall back. They slip through the American lines and onto the boats just as the British begin to stir. By 7 a.m., the last boat pushes off from Brooklyn. Washington is on it. The army, or what's left of it, has been saved. It is one of the most extraordinary military escapes in history, a masterstroke of timing and luck that would define Washington's legend. They escape, but they don't win. The Battle of Brooklyn is a catastrophic defeat. Nearly 2,000 Americans are killed, wounded, or captured. The British take control of New York City a few days later, and the city becomes a British stronghold for the rest of the war. The defeat shatters the morale of the Continental Army. Soldiers desert in droves. They've lost their homes, their pride, and their belief in victory. Washington, retreating north to Harlem Heights, is faced with the grim reality of his situation. His army is melting away. His generals are questioning his leadership. And the British are closing in. He writes to his brother, "I am wearied almost to death with the retrograde motion of things. The glorious cause, it seems, is on the brink of collapse. The dream of independence, so bright just a few months ago, is fading into the cold, hard light of a brutal reality. The British, under General William Howe, are slow and methodical. They don't chase Washington's broken army with the fury needed to finish it off. They believe the rebellion is already over. Why risk more men when you can let the Americans simply fade away? This arrogance proves to be their fatal flaw. Washington, retreating through New York and into New Jersey, uses the time to regroup. He has a new weapon, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, The American Crisis. He orders it read to every soldier. The opening line is a rallying cry for the ages, these are the times that try men's souls. The words hit home. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. It's a call to arms, a plea for courage in the face of despair. And it begins to rekindle a spark in the men's hearts. But the situation remains dire. The army is down to a few thousand men. Many of their enlistments expire at the end of the year. By January, there may be no army at all. Washington knows he needs a victory, not just for morale, but for survival. He's pushed across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, with the British on the other side. The river is icy, the weather is brutal, and his men are freezing. He faces a choice: make a desperate, foolhardy attack, or watch the revolution freeze to death. He decides to strike. The target is Trenton, New Jersey, a garrison of Hessian mercenaries. It's a daring, almost insane plan. He will cross the Delaware River on Christmas night, in the middle of a nor'easter, and attack at dawn. It's a gamble that could destroy his army, but it's a gamble he has to take. He has nothing left to lose. Christmas night, 1776. Washington's plan is set in motion. He has 3 crossing points planned, but only his main force will make it across the icy river. The storm is a howling monster. The men are ferried across in Durham boats, large, flat-bottomed boats used for hauling freight. It's a terrifying crossing. The river is choked with ice, and the boats are tossed in the freezing water. Men and horses are soaked to the bone. They march through the bitter cold, their muskets useless in the driving snow. They have no idea if they'll survive the night. But they press on. At dawn, they descend on Trenton. The Hessians, still sleeping off their Christmas celebrations, are caught completely by surprise. In a short, brutal engagement, the Americans capture nearly 900 Hessians. Washington's losses are almost zero. It's a stunning, improbable victory, a bolt of lightning in the darkest hour. The revolution is not dead. It has a pulse. And it will fight on. But this is just the beginning. A new phase of the war is about to begin, one that will test the very soul of the nation. What happens next, in the brutal winter that follows, will determine if this new nation can survive its own birth. The story of that desperate fight for survival continues in the next part. Will the army hold together? And what price will they pay for this single, fragile victory? Subscribe now, and be here for the next chapter of this incredible story. You won't want to miss what happens when the world closes in on Washington's army. The euphoria of Trenton was intoxicating, but Washington knew it was a temporary high. The powder was barely dry on the muskets before the cold reality set in. His army, those who remained, was a skeleton. Hundreds of men, their enlistments fulfilled, were already marching home, their backs to the cause. The victory had bought them a moment, but not a future. The British were furious, their pride wounded. General Cornwallis, a bulldog of a commander, was already mobilizing a force of over 8,000 men to crush the rebellion once and for all. He was determined to trap Washington between his army and the frozen Delaware River. The net was closing, and the American cause was about to face its most brutal test yet. The question wasn't if they could win, it was if they could even survive the next 2 weeks. Cornwallis moved with brutal efficiency. By January 2, 1777, his redcoats had pushed Washington's army back to the banks of the Delaware at Trenton. The Americans were exhausted, outnumbered, and cornered. That night, the British camped just a few miles away, their campfires blazing in the cold air like 1,000 angry eyes. Cornwallis was confident. He told his officers they had bagged the old fox and planned to finish him off in the morning. But Washington was not a fox to be caught so easily. As the British slept, he convened a council of war. The situation was hopeless. But in that moment of despair, a desperate, brilliant idea was born. They would not retreat. They would not surrender. They would slip away in the dead of night, leaving their campfires burning to fool the British, and march towards Princeton to strike at the British rear. It was a move so audacious, so completely unexpected, that it just might work. The march was a nightmare. The ground was frozen solid, the wind cut through their ragged coats like a knife. They left behind a few men to keep the campfires burning, feeding them with extra wood to create the illusion of a sleeping army. As they moved, a cold rain began to fall, turning the roads to mud. They had to muffle the wheels of their cannons with rags to keep them quiet. Men stumbled and fell, their hands and feet numb with cold. But they pushed on, driven by a desperate hope. By dawn, they had marched over a dozen miles and reached the outskirts of Princeton. The British garrison there was completely unaware of their approach. They were preparing for a leisurely morning, confident that the main American army was trapped miles away. The stage was set for another stunning surprise. The Continental Army, which had been on the brink of extinction just hours before, was about to strike again. The Battle of Princeton was a chaotic, brutal affair. The Americans, exhausted from their night march, collided with the British 17th Regiment. The fighting was fierce and close quarters. Washington, ever the bold leader, rode to the front lines, rallying his troops and exposing himself to enemy fire. A musket ball whistled past his ear, but he never flinched. His presence on the battlefield was electric, his calm demeanor inspiring his men to hold their ground. The British, caught off guard and outnumbered in the initial clash, broke and ran. The Americans swept through the town, capturing supplies and prisoners. The victory was complete. But it came at a cost. Among the wounded was a young officer named James Monroe, a man who would one day become the 5th President of the United States. His blood, spilled on this frozen field, was a reminder that the price of liberty was paid in flesh and bone. Princeton was a masterstroke. It shattered the myth of British invincibility and forced Cornwallis to retreat back towards New Brunswick. Washington, his army exhausted but victorious, could have pushed on, but he knew his men had reached their limit. They had been marching and fighting for days with little sleep and less food. He made the difficult decision to break off the pursuit and move to winter quarters in Morristown. The victories at Trenton and Princeton had done more than just boost morale, they had saved the Revolution. Recruits who had been hesitant to enlist now flocked to the cause. The army, which was on the verge of dissolving, was now a force to be reckoned with. But Washington knew that this was just a reprieve. The British were still powerful, and the war was far from over. The Continental Army needed time to rest, to train, and to rebuild. The winter would be a test of endurance, a test that would determine if this fragile nation had the strength to survive. As the Continental Army settled into its winter camp, the nation took a breath. The victories had transformed the mood from despair to defiance. But the deeper question remained unanswered: could this new nation, born of a declaration and sustained by a string of desperate gambles, truly hold its own against the mightiest empire on earth? The battles had been won, but the war was far from over. And for George Washington, the weight of command was heavier than ever. He knew that the British would return with a vengeance in the spring. He knew that his army was still fragile, still undersupplied, and still reliant on the thin thread of hope. The survival of the revolution now depended on something more than just military victories. It depended on the resolve of a people, the strength of a fledgling government, and the leadership of a man who carried the hopes of a nation on his shoulders. What happened in that winter camp, and the plans that were being laid across the Atlantic, would set the stage for a conflict that would test the very soul of the new nation. Could Washington hold his army together? And what new threat was being assembled in London, ready to crush this rebellion once and for all? The fate of the revolution hung in the balance. If you want to see how this fragile nation survived its first true trial by winter, and what the British Empire was preparing to unleash, you need to stay with us. Subscribe now and don't miss the next chapter in this fight for freedom. Morristown, New Jersey. The winter of 1777 was not a season of rest, it was a crucible. Washington's army, though victorious, was a skeleton force. The enlistments that had swelled their ranks after Trenton were temporary. The men who remained were the hardcore, the believers, but they were also ragged, hungry, and exhausted. Washington knew that to survive the spring, he needed to forge this collection of farmers and merchants into a professional army. He needed discipline. He needed training. He needed a miracle in the form of a man who understood the science of war. And as if answering a prayer, a new figure arrived in camp, a man who would transform the Continental Army from a mob into a fighting force. The fate of the revolution now rested not on grand battles, but on the grueling, unglamorous work of drilling on a frozen field. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. A Prussian military officer, he arrived at Valley Forge later, but his spirit was already being felt in the camps of 1777. He spoke little English, but he spoke the universal language of discipline. He took the raw recruits and taught them how to march in step, how to maneuver as a unit, how to handle their muskets with deadly efficiency. He turned the army's weaknesses into strengths. But even as the Americans drilled, a dark cloud was gathering far to the north. The British were not idle. They were planning a massive, coordinated campaign. Their goal was to seize control of the Hudson River, a move that would slice the rebellious colonies in two. The plan was bold, ambitious, and if successful, it would be the end of the American Revolution. And at the head of this northern army was a man who believed he could crush the rebellion in a single season. That man was John Burgoyne. Gentleman Johnny, they called him. He was a charismatic British general, a playwright, and a man of immense ego. His plan was to lead a powerful force south from Canada, down the Lake Champlain corridor, and capture Fort Ticonderoga. From there, he would push towards Albany, where he would meet up with another British force coming from the west, and a third advancing up the Hudson from New York City. It was a giant three-pronged pincer movement designed to crush the rebellion in one decisive blow. Burgoyne was confident, even arrogant. He predicted a swift and glorious victory. But he had underestimated his enemy. He had underestimated the terrain. And he had underestimated the resilience of the men who had just survived the winter at Morristown. The whisper of this campaign was already reaching Washington's ears, and he knew the coming months would decide everything. The Continental Army would have to be ready for a fight unlike any before. While Burgoyne prepared his grand invasion, Washington faced a different kind of war. The British had occupied Philadelphia, and the Continental Congress was on the run. The winter of 1777 was a time of political and military frustration. Washington's army, now better trained thanks to Steuben's relentless drills, was still outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The British commander, Sir William Howe, was content to sit in the comfort of Philadelphia, while Washington's army struggled to survive in the frozen fields of Valley Forge. It was a test of endurance. The soldiers had no proper shoes, no warm blankets, and little food. Yet, they did not desert. They had been forged in the fire of battle and tempered by the discipline of the drill field. They were no longer the same men who had fled from Brooklyn. They had become something new, a professional army, hardened by suffering and united by a common cause. The winter was a brutal teacher, but it was teaching them what it took to win a revolution. Even in the midst of this suffering, a new hope was being forged. The French, watching from across the Atlantic, were taking notice. The American victory at Saratoga was still months away, but the resilience shown by Washington's army was making an impression on the courts of Europe. Benjamin Franklin, the wily old diplomat in Paris, was using every bit of his charm and cunning to secure a formal alliance. He knew that the survival of the United States depended on it. The British were too strong, their navy too powerful. The Americans needed a European power to balance the scales. And France, humiliated by its losses in the 7 Years' War, was eager for revenge against its old rival. The success of the revolution no longer rested solely on the battlefield. It also rested on the delicate dance of diplomacy. A secret message from Paris could change everything, turning a colonial rebellion into a global war. The whispers of this potential alliance were spreading through the camp like a spark in dry tinder. The stage was set for the most critical campaign of the war yet. Washington knew the British would strike north, but he was uncertain of their exact plans. He had to protect the Hudson, and he had to protect the fledgling nation's credibility. The whispers of Burgoyne's advance were growing louder. His army was massive, a mix of British regulars, German Hessians, and Native American allies. They were cutting a swath through the wilderness, pushing towards Albany. But their progress was slow, hindered by terrain and the harassment of American militia. The British had expected a triumphant march, but they were finding that this was a different kind of war. On the American side, generals like Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold were preparing to stop them. What was about to happen in the dense forests of upstate New York would be the hinge upon which the entire revolution turned. It was the moment when a group of exhausted, determined men would meet the might of the British Empire head-on. The fate of a nation was about to be decided in the woods of Saratoga. What choices would be made in that moment of crisis? And how would a young nation, born of a declaration, survive its ultimate trial? If you want to uncover the secrets of that pivotal battle, and witness the decision that shocked the world, you need to stay with us. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next chapter, where the guns of Saratoga will roar and change history forever. The British plan was elegant on paper, a three-pronged assault to split the rebellious colonies in two. General John Burgoyne would drive south from Canada, seize Fort Ticonderoga, and push toward Albany. Colonel Barry Street Ledger would sweep in from the west through the Mohawk Valley. And General William Howe would march north from New York City to meet them. A perfect vice, designed to crush the rebellion in one decisive campaign. But as Burgoyne's army of nearly 8,000 men, British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, and Native American allies, began their march, the plan started to unravel. The terrain was brutal, the forests dense, and every mile forward was a fight. The Americans, under the cautious command of General Philip Schuyler, fell back but destroyed bridges, felled trees across the roads, and drove away livestock. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. And Burgoyne, the confident gentleman, was walking straight into a trap he couldn't see. While Burgoyne was struggling through the wilderness, a different kind of battle was being fought in the American camp, a battle of ego and pride. General Horatio Gates, a former British officer, had been given command of the Northern Department. He was a cautious, methodical man, beloved by Congress. But he was also jealous of his authority. And standing in his shadow was Benedict Arnold, the hero of Quebec and the man whose courage had helped win at Saratoga's doorstep. Arnold was a fighter, a man of action who despised Gates's caution. The two clashed constantly. Gates wanted to build fortifications and wait for Burgoyne to come to them. Arnold wanted to attack, to strike the British while they were strung out and vulnerable. The tension between them was a powder keg, and the fate of the revolution sat on top of it. As Burgoyne's army inched closer, the question was not just whether the Americans could win, but whether their own disunity would tear them apart first. By mid-September 1777, Burgoyne's army had finally reached the banks of the Hudson River, but they were exhausted, low on supplies, and facing a much larger American force that had grown with each passing day. The American militia had swarmed to the cause, their numbers swelling Gates's army to over 7,000 men. Gates, still cautious, had fortified a line of hills at Bemis Heights, blocking the road to Albany. He was content to wait. Burgoyne, however, had no choice but to attack. On September 19, he launched his forces south toward the American position. He sent a column of his best troops through the dense woods to probe the American left flank. They marched straight into a clearing near a farm owned by a loyalist named John Freeman. And it was there, in that quiet field, that the first thunder of the guns of Saratoga tore through the autumn air. The British were met by a furious volley from Daniel Morgan's sharpshooters, marksmen from Virginia and Pennsylvania who could hit a target from 200 yards. The fighting at Freeman's farm was savage and chaotic. Wave after wave of British troops crashed against the American line, only to be driven back by the deadly accurate fire of Morgan's riflemen. The British even managed to seize the farmhouse and the fence line, but they couldn't break through. For hours, the battle raged, neither side giving an inch. And it was in the midst of this hell that Benedict Arnold, frustrated by Gates's refusal to send reinforcements, could stand it no longer. He rode to the front lines, taking personal command of the troops, rallying them with his sheer presence. He was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of courage, leading charges and encouraging the men. The soldiers, inspired by their general's audacity, fought with renewed fury. By the end of the day, the British had paid a terrible price for a few hundred yards of ground. They had suffered nearly 600 casualties, more than double the American losses. Burgoyne's army was bleeding, and they were still no closer to Albany. But for the American command, a dangerous rift had been torn open. Arnold had defied orders, and Gates was furious. In the days that followed, the British camp was a place of despair. Burgoyne's army, once confident and proud, was now a shadow of its former self. They were low on food, ammunition, and hope. Desertions were on the rise, and the surrounding woods were teeming with American militia who picked off any soldier who strayed too far. Burgoyne waited for news from General Howe in the south, but it never came. Howe had gone to Philadelphia instead, leaving Burgoyne to his fate. The British general was trapped. He had two choices: retreat north to Canada, or try to break through the American lines one last time. On October 7, he made his desperate move. He sent a force of 1,500 men to test the American left flank. They were met not by a cautious defense, but by a ferocious assault. Benedict Arnold, again without permission, had ridden to the sound of the guns. He took command of the American counterattack, leading a furious charge against the British line. He was shot in the leg, the same leg wounded at Quebec, but he kept fighting, his horse carrying him into the very heart of the enemy position. The American assault broke the British will to fight. The redoubts fell, one by one. Burgoyne's army, now shattered and surrounded, had no choice but to surrender. On October 17, 1777, the British general, in his full regalia, marched out of his camp to meet the American commanders. He surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men to General Horatio Gates. It was the largest surrender of a British army in history at that time. The victory at Saratoga was complete, a stunning, decisive triumph that sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. The American cause, once on the verge of collapse, was now a beacon of hope. And in Paris, Benjamin Franklin knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. The French court, seeing that the Americans could actually win, was now ready to commit. The alliance was sealed, and the war became truly global. But for Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, a bitter seed of resentment was already taking root. He had been denied credit, denied command, and treated with disrespect by Gates. The man who had given everything for his country was about to be consumed by his own bitterness. What would drive a man who had shed so much blood to turn his back on it all? And what dark secret was festering in his heart? If you want to uncover the truth behind the revolution's greatest hero and its most infamous traitor, you need to stay with us. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next chapter, where a betrayal will shock the world. The guns of Saratoga had barely fallen silent when the true nature of this war began to reveal itself. It wasn't just about soldiers on a battlefield anymore. It was about survival against an enemy far more relentless than the British, the winter itself. And as the snow began to fall, George Washington made a decision that would either forge a nation or break it forever. He marched his weary, ragged army not to the comfort of a warm city, but to a remote, windswept plateau in Pennsylvania. A place called Valley Forge. The choice seemed insane. No fortifications, no shelter, and barely enough food to feed a starving village. Why would any general choose such a desolate place to camp? Because Washington understood something his enemies didn't. He wasn't just fighting the British Army. He was fighting for the soul of a future nation, and that fight would be won in the frozen mud and bitter cold, far from the eyes of the world. When the Continental Army marched into Valley Forge on December 19, 1777, they were a sight of utter desperation. 12,000 men, many without shoes, their bare feet leaving bloody tracks in the snow. They were wrapped in rags that could barely be called uniforms, and their faces were gaunt from hunger. The army was sick, demoralized, and on the verge of mutiny. Washington watched them from his headquarters, a small, drafty stone house. He knew that if he couldn't feed these men and keep them together, the revolution would die here, not with a bang, but with a whimper in the Pennsylvania wilderness. The soldiers themselves were not professional killers, they were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers who had left their homes for a cause they barely understood. Now, they were paying the ultimate price for their belief in liberty. The first order of business was simple survival. They felled trees and built log huts, 12 by 14 feet, cramming 12 men into each one. The air was thick with smoke from green wood fires, but it was the only warmth they had. But the cold was only half the battle. The other half was hunger and disease. The supply lines had collapsed. The farmers who had promised food were selling to the British for hard currency instead of worthless continental dollars. The army's food stores were nearly empty. The daily ration for a soldier was a meager mix of flour and water, baked into a tasteless, rock-hard cake known as fire cake. Meat was a distant memory. Dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia swept through the camp like wildfire. In a single month, nearly 2,000 men died from disease and malnutrition. The sick were crowded into crude hospital huts, where the smell of death was so thick you could taste it. Washington was tortured by the suffering of his men. He wrote letter after letter to Congress, begging for supplies, but his pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears. The men were losing faith, not just in their cause, but in their leaders. There were whispers of mutiny, of desertion, of going home to save their families. The army was on the brink of dissolution. What could possibly hold these suffering men together? Into this hell, a savior arrived. Not an angel from heaven, but a flamboyant, eccentric Prussian military officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. He had served on the general staff of Frederick the Great, the most disciplined army in Europe. He spoke almost no English, and his credentials were, to say the least, a bit inflated. But he had a fire in his eyes and a gift for discipline. Washington, desperate for anything that could save his army, appointed him as acting inspector general. Von Steuben didn't just drill the troops, he transformed them. He took the ragged, individualistic Americans and taught them how to march in formation, how to handle their muskets with deadly efficiency, and how to charge a bayonet as a single, unstoppable unit. He would curse at them in French and German, and his aide would translate his profanity into even more colorful English. The soldiers loved him. They called him Baron. He turned their humiliation into pride, their chaos into order. Day after day, in the freezing cold, he drilled them until their movements became second nature. He was forging a new army out of the ashes of the old. While the Americans froze at Valley Forge, the British were living a very different life just 20 miles away in Philadelphia. General Howe and his officers were enjoying the finest wines, sumptuous banquets, and the company of Loyalist society. They attended plays, balls, and concerts. For them, the war was all but over. They had captured the American capital, and they assumed the rebel army would simply melt away during the winter. But they were fatally wrong. They did not see the transformation happening in the frozen woods. They did not see the new discipline, the new confidence, the new fighting spirit that von Steuben was instilling in every single soldier. They saw only a ragged, beaten army hiding in the wilderness. This arrogance, this profound underestimation of their enemy, was a strategic blunder of epic proportions. While the British dined and danced, the American army was being reborn. And across the ocean in Paris, Benjamin Franklin was working his own kind of magic. The victory at Saratoga had opened the door, and on February 6, 1778, France officially recognized American independence and signed a treaty of alliance. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion, it was a global conflict, and the world's greatest naval power was now on the side of the revolution. The winter of 1778 was a crucible, and the American army emerged from it as hardened steel. But the fire that forged them also left deep scars. As the snow began to melt, Washington knew the war was far from over. He had his army, but he was haunted by the fragility of his cause. And in the shadows, another kind of battle was brewing. The hero of Saratoga, Benedict Arnold, the man who had given his leg and nearly his life for the revolution, was festering with resentment. He felt cheated of his glory, passed over for promotion, and humiliated by his political enemies. While he convalesced in Philadelphia, he fell in love with a young woman from a Loyalist family, Peggy Shippen. She was charming, beautiful, and connected to the British. In the gilded drawing rooms of the occupied city, Arnold began to listen to a different kind of whisper. It wasn't a call to arms, but a call to betrayal. He was a man of immense pride, and his pride had been wounded. As the new campaign season dawned, one question hung in the air, a question that would threaten to undo everything that had been won: how far would a broken hero go to reclaim his honor? What secret was he about to trade for his own redemption? The fate of the revolution now rested on the answer. If you want to uncover the truth behind the revolution's greatest hero and its most infamous traitor, you need to stay with us. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next chapter, where a betrayal will shock the world. But while Washington forged his army into steel at Valley Forge, the British were about to make a decision that would define the war. With France now in the fight, London panicked. They ordered General Clinton to abandon Philadelphia, consolidate his forces in New York, and prepare for a possible French invasion. Clinton was a different kind of commander than Howe. He was cautious, methodical, and deeply aware that his army was now a target. He had to move his 10,000 men and all their supplies across New Jersey, through hostile territory. It was a massive, slow-moving target. Washington saw it immediately. He had trained his army for this exact moment. The question was no longer if they would fight, but where. The answer came in the Pine Barrens of Monmouth, a place of brutal heat and unforgiving terrain. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything the Continental Army had learned. On June 28, 1778, the heat was unbearable, a suffocating blanket that sucked the air from your lungs. The British column stretched for 12 miles, a slow-moving serpent of red coats, wagons, and camp followers. General Charles Lee, Washington's second-in-command, had been given the honor of leading the initial attack. Lee was a paradox, a man of great military experience and even greater ego, who secretly doubted the very soldiers he now commanded. When he saw the size of the British rear guard, he hesitated. He ordered a retreat instead of an advance, throwing his own attack into chaos. His troops began to fall back, and the British counterattacked. The battle was turning into a disaster. Washington rode onto the field in a fury, a rare display of unbridled rage. He confronted Lee directly, his voice cutting through the gunfire. The army watched as their commander risked everything to stop the retreat. Washington's arrival was like a thunderclap. He didn't just rally the troops, he transformed the field. He rode through the chaos, his tall figure a beacon on horseback, personally directing regiments into a new defensive line. He gave the army a target, a purpose. The British, sensing victory, launched a ferocious assault. But this was not the same army that had fled from New York. These men stood their ground. They fired disciplined volleys, maneuvered with a precision they had never shown before, and held their line. It was the training of von Steuben made manifest in the smoke and heat of battle. The British attack stalled and then broke. The legendary discipline of the British infantry, the finest in Europe, was matched and repulsed by the Americans. For the first time in the open field, against equal numbers, the Continental Army had fought the British to a standstill. The sun began to set, leaving the field strewn with dead and dying. Both armies were exhausted. As darkness fell, a strange silence settled over the battlefield of Monmouth. The wounded moaned in the tall grass, a haunting chorus under the stars. Washington ordered his men to sleep on their arms, ready to renew the attack at dawn. But when the first light of June 29 crept across the field, the British were gone. Clinton had slipped away under the cover of night, leaving his dead unburied and his wounded behind. He had abandoned the field, but he had escaped with his main army intact. The battle was a tactical victory for the Americans, a moral victory that proved their new mettle. But it was also a missed opportunity. The British army had escaped to fight another day. Washington was furious, not at his men, but at Charles Lee. Lee's insubordination and hesitation had cost them the chance for a decisive, war-ending blow. The Revolution had won a battle, but the war was far from over. And a new kind of war was just beginning. The Battle of Monmouth was a turning point, but not just on the battlefield. In its aftermath, a war within a war began to tear at the fabric of the American leadership. Charles Lee, humiliated and enraged, did not stay silent. He wrote a series of insubordinate letters to Washington, demanding a court-martial to clear his name. He attacked Washington's character and his leadership, turning the dispute into a public spectacle. The court-martial found Lee guilty, and he was suspended from command. He was a man whose brilliance was consumed by his own ego, a stark warning of how personal pride could threaten the cause. But Lee was not the only one wrestling with pride and resentment. Far away in Philadelphia, a hero was festering. Benedict Arnold, the man who had won Saratoga, now hobbled by his wounds, was given command of the city. He was surrounded by luxury and temptation, and he was being courted by the charming, loyalist Peggy Shippen. The whispers of betrayal were growing louder. So as the summer of 1778 burned on, the Revolution had survived its darkest hours. The army was reborn, an alliance with France was secured, and a major British offensive had been blunted. But the cost was high, and the path ahead was shrouded in treachery. Washington moved his army to White Plains, New York, to keep a watchful eye on the British in Manhattan. The war in the North was settling into a bitter stalemate. But the seeds of a far more dangerous conflict were being sown. One man, once the most brilliant soldier in the American army, was about to betray everything he had fought for. Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, was in Philadelphia, living a life of luxury on borrowed money, his resentment curdling into something monstrous. He was in love with a woman whose loyalties were firmly with the crown. And he was about to make a choice that would turn his name into a curse for generations. What would it take for a man to trade away his country's trust? What secret was he planning to deliver into the hands of the enemy? The next chapter of this story will expose the darkest betrayal of the revolution. To witness the fall of a hero and the secret plot that nearly destroyed America, you must see what happens next. Subscribe now, and be here when we uncover the shocking truth of Benedict Arnold's treason. By the winter of 1779, the revolution had survived Trenton, Saratoga, and the frozen hell of Valley Forge. But the new year brought a test even more brutal. The Continental Army marched into Morristown, New Jersey, not to fight the British, but to fight the weather itself. Washington's men built log huts on windswept hills, but the snow came down in a fury that buried the entire region. Historians would call it the worst winter of the century. Temperatures dropped so low that the Hudson River froze solid, and the soldiers, starving and half-naked, ate their own shoes to survive. But the true poison wasn't the cold. It was the whispers from Philadelphia. Rumors of corruption, of a hero living in luxury while his men starved. And at the center of those rumors stood Benedict Arnold, the man who had once saved the revolution, now sinking deeper into a pit of resentment and debt. So while Washington froze with his army, Benedict Arnold was dancing in the ballrooms of Philadelphia. The hero of Saratoga had been given command of the city, and he lived like a king. He filled his mansion with fine silks, expensive furniture, and the most sought-after woman in Pennsylvania. But this life was built on a mountain of debt. Arnold was spending money he didn't have, and his enemies in Congress were watching his every move. They accused him of using his position for personal gain, of abusing his power. Arnold demanded a court-martial to clear his name, but the proceedings dragged on, feeding his growing paranoia. He felt betrayed by the country he had bled for. Every insult, every delay, every accusation gnawed at his soul. And in the shadows, the loyalists of Philadelphia saw an opportunity. They began to whisper in his ear, offering him a way out, a path to wealth and revenge. And then there was Peggy Shippen. Young, beautiful, and fiercely loyal to the British crown. She was the perfect wife for a man like Arnold, charming, intelligent, and utterly devoted to his ambition. But her loyalty was not to America. Through her, the British had a direct line into Arnold's heart. They knew about his debts, his anger, and his wounds. They knew he was a prize waiting to be claimed. In the spring of 1780, as the court-martial finally cleared Arnold of the most serious charges, the British made their move. A secret correspondence began. Letters written in invisible ink, passed through loyalist channels. They weren't just offering Arnold money. They were offering him a chance to strike a blow so devastating it would end the war in a single stroke. The target? West Point. The most important fortress in America. The key to the entire Hudson River. West Point. It was the linchpin of the American defense. A fortification built on a curve of the Hudson River, its chains and cannons blocked the British Navy from splitting the colonies in two. If West Point fell, the war was lost. And it was there, in the summer of 1780, that Washington placed his most trusted hero. He gave Arnold command of the fort. It was the ultimate vote of confidence. But Arnold saw it as the ultimate opportunity. The British offered him £20,000 for the fort's plans. £20,000. A fortune that would erase his debts and secure his future. In August, Arnold met secretly with a British spy, a man named John Andre. They met in the woods near the fort, under the cover of darkness. Arnold handed over the plans for West Point's defenses. He gave the enemy the blueprint for America's destruction. All that was left was for Andre to get the papers back to the British lines. But fate, it seems, had other plans. John Andre, the British spy, was captured by 3 American militiamen on September 23, 1780. They found the plans for West Point hidden in his boot. The papers were sent up the chain of command, straight to George Washington. Washington was on his way to West Point to meet with Arnold when the news reached him. He couldn't believe it. His most trusted general, the hero of Saratoga, a traitor. It was a gut-wrenching moment. Washington knew he had to act fast. But his caution gave Arnold a head start. When Arnold heard of André's capture, he knew his time was up. He fled his quarters, boarded a boat on the Hudson, and escaped to the British warship Vulture. He was gone before Washington could even give the order to arrest him. The trap had been sprung, but the prize had slipped away. So there he was. Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, now a colonel in the British Army. The man who had given everything for liberty had sold it all for silver. And Washington was left to pick up the pieces. He had to prove that the revolution was stronger than one man's betrayal. That the cause was worth more than a traitor's gold. But the damage was done. The revelation of Arnold's treason shook the nation to its core. It made everyone question who they could trust. And the question that haunted Washington, the one that kept him up at night, was this: how far had the betrayal spread? Were there other Arnolds in his army, waiting for their moment to strike? He had caught this one by pure luck. What other plots were still in motion? The war was far from over, and the most dangerous enemy was no longer on the battlefield. He was wearing the same uniform, sharing the same campfire. And to find out if Washington ever uncovered the full extent of the plot, or if the revolution could survive its deepest wound, you need to see what happens next. Subscribe now, and join us as we reveal the shocking aftermath of Benedict Arnold's treason. The trap had been sprung, but the prize had slipped away. Benedict Arnold was safe on the Vulture, but Major John André was not. He was a British officer, a gentleman, caught in the most dishonorable of circumstances. Washington, despite his rage, saw a man, not just a spy. He was offered a chance to be exchanged for Arnold, a chance to save his own life. But André refused. He knew his duty. He knew the price of being a spy. To accept such a trade would be to validate the very treason that had nearly destroyed the army. He chose to die with honor instead of living with shame. On October 2, 1780, he was led to the gallows. Witnesses say he walked with a calm dignity that moved even his executioners. His last words were, "I am ready to die for my country." But the question that hung in the air, the one that chilled Washington to the bone, was this: whose country was he dying for? André was gone, but the poison Arnold had injected was still spreading. While Washington tried to lance the wound, the traitor was already being repurposed by the British. They saw him not as a man, but as a weapon. He was given a command, not in a decisive theater, but in a place designed to bleed the Americans dry, Virginia. His mission was simple: destroy supplies, burn warehouses, and crush the morale of the southern states. Arnold, eager to prove his worth to his new masters, threw himself into the role with a savagery that shocked even his own men. He led raids up the James River, his path marked by plumes of smoke. In January of 1781, he reached the state capital, Richmond. With a force of just over 1,000 men, he put the city to the torch. The flames were a signal to the world that the man who once fought for liberty was now its most dedicated executioner. Thomas Jefferson, then governor of Virginia, was forced to flee, a bitter humiliation for the author of the Declaration of Independence. The news of Richmond burning reached Washington like a physical blow. It wasn't just the loss of supplies, it was the insult. The man he had trusted was now the man burning his homeland. Washington knew he had to respond, and he had to respond with a message. He couldn't spare his main army, but he could spare a man. He sent a force south, under the command of the Marquis de Lafayette, a young Frenchman whose loyalty was beyond question. But Washington also sent someone else. A man with a mission so secret, so dangerous, that even his own officers were kept in the dark. He sent a sergeant named John Champ. Champ's orders were simple, but impossible: infiltrate Arnold's camp, gain his trust, and then, capture him. Bring him back alive. Not to hang him, but to stand trial, to prove to the world that American justice was greater than British gold. Champ was to defect, to play the part of a traitor himself, in order to catch one. John Champ was a real soldier, a man of the Continental Line. And now, he was a ghost. He deserted his post, making sure he was seen by the right people. He was chased, but he escaped, making his way into the British lines. It was a performance that would have won him an award. He was taken to Arnold's camp, and he began to spin his tale of disillusionment. He spoke of the unpaid wages, the brutal winters, the ungrateful Congress. He was so convincing that Arnold, a master of deception himself, believed him. Champ was welcomed into the traitor's inner circle. He learned the layout of the camp. He learned Arnold's routines. He even learned when he took his nightly walks. The plan was set. Champ and his co-conspirators would grab Arnold, gag him, and spirit him away to a waiting boat on the river. The date was set. The fate of the most hated man in America was about to be sealed. But as the sun set on the day of the kidnapping, a single British regiment, hundreds of soldiers, marched into camp, and their tents were pitched right between Champ and his target. It was over. The element of surprise was gone. Champ had no choice but to abandon the mission. He had to get out before he was discovered. He slipped away in the chaos, making his way back to the American lines, his mission a failure. He reported back to Washington with a heavy heart, expecting the wrath of his commander. But Washington, ever the pragmatist, saw beyond the failure. He ordered Champ's release from duty, a silent acknowledgement of his incredible, if unfulfilled, bravery. The plan to capture Arnold was dead. And with it, the last chance for a clean, public justice for his betrayal. Arnold was now unkillable, untouchable. He was a specter, a haunting reminder of what could have been. And he was about to become even more dangerous. Freed from the threat of capture, he was given a new mission by the British command. A mission that would put him directly in the path of the French and American armies. He was going to be a hammer, and they were going to let him swing at the heart of the revolution. The hunt for Arnold was over, but his war was just beginning. He was sent to Virginia to link up with the forces under the command of a brash young British general named Banastre Tarleton. Together, they were to be the tip of the spear, raiding deep into the heart of the state, with orders to destroy the fledgling American supply lines and crush any remaining resistance. Their objective was nothing less than the complete subjugation of Virginia. But they were about to run into a thorn in their side, a man who had been trained in the brutal school of Valley Forge, a man who knew how to fight a war of movement. The Marquis de Lafayette was waiting for them. He had been sent south with a small, mobile force to counter this exact threat. He was younger than Arnold, faster, and he was fighting for a cause he believed in, not for silver. The stage was set for a deadly dance between the two most dynamic, and unlikely, commanders of the war. One a traitor, the other a foreign nobleman. The future of the revolution in the South would be decided by these two men. And as they maneuvered for an opening, the question was no longer if Arnold would be caught, but if the revolution could survive his relentless assault. What happened next would change the course of the war, and you won't want to miss a single second. Subscribe now, and we'll show you if Lafayette could stop the man who knew all of America's secrets. The hunt for Arnold was over, but his war was just beginning. He wasn't just a traitor anymore, he was a weapon, and the British pointed him straight at the heart of Virginia. His orders were simple: destroy, demoralize, and divide. He was paired with a young, ruthless cavalry officer named Banastre Tarleton, a man whose very name sent chills down American spines. Together, they were a storm of fire and terror, a two-headed serpent striking at the Commonwealth's most vital veins. They raided plantations, burned tobacco warehouses, and tore up railroad tracks, leaving a trail of ash and despair. The message was clear: no one was safe, and nothing was sacred. They were not just fighting a war, they were trying to break the spirit of a people. And with Arnold, who knew the Continental Army's every weakness, they seemed unstoppable. Virginia, once a breadbasket of the Revolution, was now its bleeding wound. Richmond was their first major target. Arnold, with a fleet of ships, sailed up the James River, his path marked by smoke and panic. The city was virtually defenseless. Governor Thomas Jefferson, the very author of the Declaration of Independence, was forced to flee on horseback just minutes ahead of the British cavalry. It was a humiliating spectacle. The capital of Virginia, the cradle of American liberty, was being burned by its most infamous son. Imagine the irony: the man who was once Washington's most trusted general now directing the destruction of the Commonwealth. But Arnold wasn't just burning buildings, he was sending a message. He was showing the Americans that no place was beyond his reach, that he could strike at the very heart of their rebellion. The raid on Richmond wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological blow, a calculated act of cruelty designed to force the colonies to their knees. And for a moment, it seemed to be working. The state was in chaos, and the Revolution's supply lines were being severed. But Richmond was just the opening act. The British objective was to crush all resistance in the South, and Arnold was their most effective instrument. He linked up with Tarleton, and together they became a roaming death sentence. They marched their forces day and night, hitting small towns and isolated militia posts with terrifying speed. Their goal was to find and destroy the one force that could stop them, the young French general, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was a man out of his depth, or so the British thought. He had a small army, barely a few thousand men, made up of raw recruits and tired Continentals. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy that knew the terrain as well as he did. But Lafayette had a secret weapon: he had learned the art of war from George Washington himself. He knew he couldn't win a straight fight, so he refused to give one. He shadowed the British, keeping his army just out of reach, waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. The dance of caution and aggression began. Lafayette was like a shadow, always present but never quite in reach. He would send out his cavalry to skirmish with the British, then pull back, luring them deeper into the Virginia countryside. He was buying time, knowing that every day he delayed Arnold, he was bringing the Revolution closer to its ultimate goal, a combined operation with the French fleet. But the trap was set to snap shut on Lafayette. After the raid on Richmond, Arnold's forces were reinforced by more British troops under the command of a new general, William Phillips. Now, the hunter was outnumbered. The pressure was immense. Lafayette's army was melting away, with men deserting, their enlistments expiring, and the state militia refusing to serve far from home. He was a general without an army, facing the most ruthless military minds of the British Empire. He had to decide: risk everything on a desperate gamble, or retreat and let Virginia suffer under the British heel. It was the greatest test of his young life. Lafayette's answer was a masterstroke of deception. He sent out spies and deserters with false information, claiming that he was retreating north to protect the main American army. He then marched his own forces in a wide arc, creating the illusion of a full-scale retreat. Arnold and Phillips, convinced they had the young Frenchman on the run, pressed their advantage. They pushed deeper into Virginia, stretching their supply lines and exhausting their troops. They believed they were winning the war of attrition. But they were walking into a trap. Lafayette had not retreated, he had merely circled around, and now he was poised to strike at their rear. He had been reinforced by a brigade of veteran Pennsylvania Continentals under General Anthony Wayne, a man known for his reckless bravery. The odds were still against him, but Lafayette finally had a chance. He was done running. He was going to turn and fight, and the hills of Virginia would run red with British blood before he let Arnold destroy the cause. The moment of decision was fast approaching. Lafayette and Wayne had finally cornered a portion of the British army under Tarleton at a small crossroads. The trap was sprung, but it was a violent, chaotic affair. The Americans charged, and the British, surprised, fought back with savage determination. Both sides were exhausted, but the Continentals under Wayne held their ground, and Tarleton, for the first time, was forced to retreat. It was a small victory, but a vital one. The chase was over, and the hunter had become the hunted. Arnold, seeing that his raiding days were becoming too dangerous, began to consolidate his forces in the fortified town of Portsmouth. He was waiting, and Lafayette knew it. He didn't have the strength to storm the town, but he had stopped the bleeding. Virginia was still bleeding, but the Revolution had a pulse. This was the turning point, the moment where the British momentum in the South was finally broken. The war was far from over, and the battle for Virginia was about to become even more desperate. And in the shadows, new, even more dangerous enemy was preparing to land on these shores. Who was this new threat, and could the fragile American alliance survive it? We'll uncover that in the next episode, so make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what happens next. The war in the South was a bleeding wound, but on the horizon, a fleet of sails appeared that would change everything. It was late summer, 1781, and Admiral de Grasse had arrived from the Caribbean with 28 French ships of the line. He wasn't just visiting, he was here to fight. This was the alliance that Franklin had promised, the muscle that diplomacy had dreamed of. For Washington, it was the signal he had been waiting for. He had been tied down in the north, watching the British, but now he saw a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Cornwallis was dug in at Yorktown, Virginia, waiting for supplies and reinforcements. He was a sitting duck. Washington took a gamble that could have ended the Revolution in a single stroke of bad luck. He marched his entire army south, leaving the northern states exposed, betting everything on one decisive move. The fate of the nation, of liberty itself, now rode on the speed of his march and the steel of the French navy. For weeks, the combined American and French armies, over 16,000 strong, tightened the noose around Yorktown. The siege began in earnest. There was no room for error, no time for the gentlemanly warfare of old. American engineers, many trained by the French, dug trenches and parallels, inching their artillery closer to the British lines. The bombardment was relentless. Day and night, cannonballs and hot shot rained down on the town, turning it into a hell on earth. Cornwallis, trapped with his 7,000 men, watched his defenses crumble. He was cut off from rescue by the French fleet, and the army he was supposed to meet was nowhere to be found. In his headquarters, he could hear the steady, terrifying thunder of the Allied guns. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that this was the end. He had fought in America for years, but this was a trap he couldn't escape. The hammer was about to fall. The final act came on the 14th of October. In the dead of night, 2 columns of elite troops stormed the key British redoubts, numbers 9 and 10. The French, led by the Baron de Viomenil, took one, while the Americans, led by Alexander Hamilton in a rare moment of glory, took the other. This was no gentleman's charge, it was a brutal, close-quarters fight with bayonets, muskets, and blood. Hamilton's men, the light infantry, overwhelmed the British defenders in minutes, a testament to the discipline forged at Valley Forge. The fall of these redoubts meant the British line was broken. The Allied artillery could now be placed to enfilade the entire British position, making it utterly untenable. The siege was over in all but name. Cornwallis, seeing his position was hopeless, attempted a desperate nighttime evacuation across the York River, but a storm scattered his boats. He was caught. The trap had snapped shut with an iron finality. On the morning of October 19, 1781, the drums of the British Army beat a sad, slow march. Cornwallis, claiming illness, sent his subordinate, General Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword. The British and Hessian troops marched out of their positions between the lines of the victorious French and American armies. The French, in their pristine white uniforms, stood on one side, and the Americans, in their worn but proud continental blues, on the other. It was a moment of profound humiliation for the British. The band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," and for the British Empire, it truly was. Thousands of redcoats laid down their arms, prisoners of a nation they had sought to crush. It was the largest surrender of a British army since Saratoga, and it was final. Washington, watching from his horse, had finally achieved the decisive victory he had dreamed of for 6 long years. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. But not everyone shared in the glory. Across the sea in London, the news of Yorktown hit like a thunderbolt. Prime Minister Lord North reportedly cried out, "Oh God! It is all over." The war, once so popular, was now a costly disaster. The political will for the fight collapsed. Across the Atlantic, the victory had a different, more personal meaning for some. Benedict Arnold, the traitor, was in New York, a man without a country. He had chosen the winning side in the short term, but he had backed the losing empire. He was shunned by the British officers who despised him for his treachery, and hated by his countrymen for his betrayal. He saw the news of Cornwallis's surrender as the death knell of his own ambitions. He was a man who had once been a hero, who had sacrificed his leg for his country, only to throw it all away for money and pride. He would die a lonely, embittered man in London, a ghost at the feast of American independence. The war was won, but the peace was not yet made. The United States of America had been born in blood and fire, but its future was still a fragile, uncertain thing. The men who had won the revolution now faced an even harder task, building a nation. Washington would soon face a new kind of battle, not against a foreign king, but against the chaos of a loose confederation of states. The army, unpaid and restless, threatened to mutiny. The government was bankrupt. And yet, a new generation of leaders, men like Hamilton, Madison, and Jefferson, were already dreaming of a more perfect union. The story of the founding was not over, it was just beginning. But what of the man who had betrayed it all? What truly drove Benedict Arnold to his fate? Was it greed, pride, or something far more sinister that festered in the shadow of his own heroism? That dark secret, the one that echoed through his final years, is a story that deserves its own telling. If you want to uncover the full, untold truth behind America's most infamous traitor, then make sure you're subscribed. The next chapter of this saga is one you won't want to miss.